All right, so this is week 13. And what I really want to do this week is review aspects of both weeks 12 and 13. So by way of a recap, if we go back and look at what we were talking about with respect to week 12, one of the key points that we wanted to make was that two things are true in the modern economy. The first point is that for the first time in human history that we know of, money is itself a product. And the growth of an industry called finance in all of its complexity is a reflection of that. The second point that we want to make when we come back and talk about the rise of the Industrial Revolution was the relationship between capital and the rise of a mercantile class. The third point that we want to make is that these together, as we said in the lecture last week, cause a kind of fundamental shift in value. And by that we mean, when we talk about the social Darwinism of the 19th century, that power and money automatically mean that you deserve more resources. And here we talked about the role of Thomas Malthus and the role of fear and scarcity in the rise of industrialism. This week, we want to add to that the notion that companies are people, and the impact that has had both on our understanding of civil rights, but also on our understanding of business. Okay, everybody good so far? Any questions? All right, then let's go back and let's look at last week again in review, and then move forward to talk about Citizens United and lobbying related matters in the second half of our lecture tonight. So by way of review, we said that in an agrarian society, value is tied to real production. And if you recall, when we talked about that, we said that in the day of the manor house in feudal society, everyone except perhaps the lord of the manor was directly involved in producing or making something. So in feudal culture, we have tangible value. The limit of value in feudal society is that only things that are tangible are considered valuable. So in some respects, you could argue that there is a one-to-one relationship between what you grow and what it's worth. We also said that by the nature of a feudal culture, it is a closed economic ecosystem. And you'll recall, we talked about feudal culture as self-contained. So while there was trade between communities, trade was not the lifeblood of a feudal community was. The lifeblood was ultimately things like agriculture, smithing, and any of those support services that enabled agriculture to survive. All right, is that good so far? Megan Beach, makes sense?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, so we said that one of the turning points occurred when value separated from tangible objects. Or in terms of more traditional economic theory, when you get a mercantile class, which is the beginning of what we now know to be the middle class, or the professional class, they make nothing tangible. In the case of a lawyer, the creation of contracts, they govern relationships. So you could argue that, at least in terms of people like lawyers, there is a more tangible value called a contract. But if I'm in the import-export business, if I buy in one town and sell in another, I make nothing. And this begins the accumulation of capital. All right, does that make sense? All right, I'm going, good, thank you. Okay, so when we talked about Karl Marx, we said that Marx's point becomes that the transition from an agrarian economy to an industrial economy is characterized by a fundamental alienation. For Marx, I am what I do. Very reminiscent also of Aristotle. When Marx talks about what I do, he is referring to work. So for Marx, any value is in the means of production. When I no longer own the means of production. They become alienated, cut off from the means of production. And for Marx, this leads to oppression. Keep in mind that for Marx, it's not only the worker, it's the owner who is alienated from his own humanity as well, because he's not making anything. So the surplus accumulation, or the accumulation of surplus value, alienates the owner as well. In terms of the conversation that we had in about the 19th century and how that fits in, one of the points that we come back to repeatedly is that the two fundamental components of Thomas Malthus's argument together lead to the fear or to the perceived need that all resources are by definition scarce, and therefore must be allocated where they can do the greatest good. Implicitly, as we saw in the 19th century, this is reinforced by social Darwinism. So part of that argument, if you'll recall, Lamarck argued that habit can be inherited. Lamarck did not know about genes and genetic programming. Therefore, in Lamarck's way of looking at things, if we apply this to humans, the humans with the best habits are implicitly the ones who best shape the future of our species. So when we combine Lamarck with Thomas Malthus, we shouldn't be surprised that in that world, the rich, educated, powerful are viewed as those who should get more resources. And those who work in the factories you'll recall when we talked about people like Sumner and Ross, Sumner was in favor of turning off city water, turning off city sewage, not educating poor people at all, no health care, work them until they die. Work them until they die. So more specifically in terms of how this plays out. And this came up in part in the readings for this week. Every colony had a charter. Essentially, that charter constituted a colony as a company. If you came to that colony, you were the equivalent of a shareholder. And you and the company, the holder of the charter, were there for one and only one purpose. And that was to make money. So, when we move from an economy based on tangible, real products, there is an increase in the need for capital. This is the origin of banking. It's also the origin of the stock market. In the one, the paying of interest, if you take the word interest seriously, if I loan you money, I have an interest in your surviving. I have an interest in being paid back. I'm invested. In your survival. I want you to survive because when you do, I get more money. So, back to Marx briefly, the rise of the combination of stock market and banking and the modern instantiation of both bankers, money lenders, and the stock market are equity firms and venture capitalists. Corporate raiders, like Karl Icahn. He gets controlling stock in a company. He gets a seat on the board of directors. He strips the company of all of its value, sells off the parts and pieces, puts the money in his pocket. All right, any questions there before we apply this to corporate compensation for CEOs? All right, we have a hand up. Let's see what we've got. My screen is being shared. You should be able to see it. Unless yep, I'm still sharing my screen. You should be able to see that. Are you able, you're not seeing anything at all? Megan, can you see my screen?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay. I'm not sure who this is. I don't recognize the name. It says White. You will be able to, oh, hi, Whitley. Okay, yeah. If you can close some programs, that may help you. And if not, if you can at least listen, the video will be posted at some point tomorrow, and this will make more sense. Worst case, you may have to reboot. Okay, everybody else good? Okay.
Yes.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, good. So let's go back and pick up where we left off. So we know the increase in compensation for a CEO has outstripped compensation for anyone else. And if we look at 1970 to 2017, the last year for which numbers are conclusively available, inflation has been 400%. For the so-called middle class, income has increased 12 to 14%. For the top 1%, which includes, of course, the CEOs, it has been greater than 400%. We mentioned last time as well that they are in part protected even when they fail by the golden parachute. So even if they're terminated, for example, when he was fired at GE, he walked away with millions of dollars in his pocket. And if we wonder why, it comes back to fundamentally social Darwinism, and money is a product. You could also argue in the 1990s, in the early 2000s, the argument was that access to knowledge, which is to say, if you knew how to find things on the web, was power. But increasingly, as the economy has become virtual, it's capital. When we look at the model for retailers like Amazon, while there are Amazon branded products, and while Amazon makes things like the Fire Stick, Alexa, I can't tell you whether or not these are truly homegrown, or in the case of their tablet, it's simply a version of the Android operating system. And in reality, any one of us could do this. We can buy a product, slap a logo on it, and sell it. If you remember earlier in the semester, when we talked about just-in-time inventory, I don't have to own anything, but I can still make money from the transaction. So increasingly, as the economy has become virtual, compensation for CEOs has risen faster than inflation. No problem, Nicole. Take care. Okay, are there questions so far? Does this make sense? Ashori, what do you think?
Yeah, it makes sense.
Okay. Andrew, what do you think?
Makes sense.
Okay. Anything about this bother you or cause you to be concerned ethically?
Yes, there's definitely ethical concerns about it. And, not a even distribution of wealth.
Uh-huh. So what are some of the major ethical issues that you see here?
Well, I mean, the 400% increase in a CEO's salary is a ridiculous increase in a salary, especially compared to the average worker when their salary barely increases. So that's very unethical.
Yep. You may recall also last week, okay, so Whitley says, isn't it funny that a human can solely decide that another human is not equal to them based on the amount of money they have in their possession? The answer is absolutely yes. And that's been fueled in part by the C-suite phenomenon. So for example, a decade ago, you had a VP of marketing. And now you have the CMO. Chief Marketing Officer. So in addition to the CEO, you have the CIO, Chief Information Officer, Chief Financial Officer, Chief Operating Officer, Chief Marketing Officer, and potentially the Chief of Human Resources. All of whom are disproportionately compensated. You'll recall the last time we also talked about stock options as a form of compensation. So if when I'm hired, the stock is selling at $30, I might be given 10,000 options at $15. And if I'm with the company for a year or whatever time the company decides, I can turn around and sell it for 30 or whatever the price the stock is at that time. Workers can't do that. We also talked about the disproportionate access to company resources. A company car, a limo, a driver, being able to have the company pay for your membership in a country club. All at considerably more money than the average worker. And one of the points that we wanted to make when we talk about Milton Friedman, we've talked about many times, is that as far as he's concerned, since the CEO reports directly to the board of directors, he ought to receive a disproportionate amount of compensation because he is the number one employee, or she, of the board of directors. And since he or she is responsible for generating the value that the board requires, he or she ought to be paid more money. So back in the early part of the semester, we also said that what's happened, if we go back to the Marshall Plan, the end of the Second World War, is that beginning in the 1960s, there's a conscious attempt to reduce the number of workers and you may remember we said that initially it attacked the unskilled workers. And then by the 1990s, the idea was to go after middle management. 2, to go offshore to third world countries where labor is simply cheaper. Drive the price of the stock up, which disproportionately rewards the board of directors who are not even involved in the business on a day-to-day basis. So ultimately, here we are. And this process, as we've noted throughout the semester, has been largely driven by technology. And even apart from that, companies like Google really don't have a product. They have intellectual capital. The mathematics that makes their search engine better than other people's. And the concept of intellectual capital has no tangible value. So someone with a great idea can start a website and sell out for billions of dollars and not make a single penny in the process. Why? Because investors are buying value, not a product. And that is fundamentally flawed. So if you watch what's happening in American culture and the American economy, this is it. Does an influencer sell anything? Not directly. Does someone with 1 million followers sell anything? Not really. Experience is not a product. So in addition to the concept of an idea having a value, the same thing has happened with experience. As long as we continue to decouple value from tangible goods and services, as long as we continue to operate from the perspective of social Darwinism, this problem will not be resolved. All right, any other questions or comments so far before we begin to talk about this week and the time that's left?
I just have one comment. The experiences can sort of be a product, right? Because tourism, that's a big industry, and a lot of countries completely rely on that. And that's definitely like an experience. People come to your country and have an experience. So you're selling your country and your culture. So.
Well, you're right. And if we look at tourism, the idea is that you want to get people to exchange experience for capital. Come here and have a good time. And in part, you know, they do have to eat. They do have to sleep. But what they're selling is not the food, not the sleep, but the experience. This was pioneered very early on by McDonald's. And if you think about fast food in general, it's fundamentally unhealthy. But you're not eating unhealthy food. You're taking your child to have a happy meal. And the same thing was done for years by Coke. One of the ones I found most interesting how do you open happiness? I caught one of their commercials over the weekend, and the word they used was magic. When I was a kid, it was have a Coke and a smile. Kodak did the same thing. It wasn't a photograph, it was a Kodak moment. So as our economy has moved from consumerism, or from a more tangible product-based economy, it's moved away from tangible goods and services increasingly to experience, to the perception that a better experience is worth more money. I mean, why do we put millions of dollars in the hands of men who run up and down the court in their underwear, putting a ball through a hoop? Figuratively on the underwear part, because it's all about the experience. And at the same time, brands have taken on value of their own. And we talk about the value of the Facebook brand. We talk about the value of the Cadillac brand, or BMW, or Givenchy, or pick the one you want. So it's not about goods and services. It's not about the crop. It's not about the horse or the cow. It's about the perception of value. It's about the experience. And this will continue to enable people to disproportionately collect and take out of the system capital, which ultimately makes some people poor. Or to put it more directly, some people to be extremely rich and everybody else to be poor. So to sum it up, the problem of CEO compensation being out of control is a deeper problem. And that's the problem of attaching value to the collection of currency, of capital, which has caused a disproportionate shift in capitalist culture away from production to the perception of value. In concrete terms, if we think we're going to ever get universal health care when we're operating intellectually in this worldview, the answer is no. Because if you truly were valuable, you'd have the money to pay for it. And that's true of every other aspect of our society. All right, any questions or comments? All right. It's particularly interesting when you look at the readings for this week that the Citizens United ruling has really turned the universe upside down. So if we look at some of the points that this article makes, the assumption from the beginning, the case of Roscoe Conkling is quite fascinating in this context, was that a distinction was drawn between having some rights and liberty. So while we could acknowledge that all businesses had some rights, only people, only humans had liberty. Citizens United essentially says that companies are persons. And that, by the way, is symptomatic of a deeper problem in our society. If you think about what's happened with the abortion debate, the initial argument was that since the fetus was not viable, it could be terminated. The problem is that we no longer know what that means. When my son was born, he was 6 weeks premature. And the doctor said, "You're lucky he's being born this year because 5 years ago we couldn't have saved him." Well, now we can put a fetus in an incubator when it's as young as 6 weeks old. And since it's technically surviving outside of its mother's womb, it's viable. So the conversation in later years has shifted to the argument that the fetus is not a person. So the question of whether it's human or not doesn't even enter. And similarly, we don't talk about humans having liberty now. We talk about persons. So if a corporation is a person, this is particularly dangerous PACs have different rules. The rules that bind individual voters typically don't bind PACs. Oh, by the way, it's Political Action Committee. I ran into that the other night when I came home. There was campaign literature on my front doorstep trashing a pro-life candidate, pointing to a website that was clearly pro-life, which had no contact us or other identification that suggested who owned it, but it pointed to the Susan B. Anthony list. And when I went to the site for the Susan B. Anthony list, conveniently, sites like this are supposed to give you a contact information. It's federal law. The email address was so small that unless you knew where to find it, you couldn't see it. And since the contact information is supposed to be identifiable, separate from the color of the background, it was a very subtle shade of blue different. And when you think of Susan B. Anthony, you think of someone who fought for women's rights. And here is a very conservative group of people funding multiple websites pushing a pro-life position. Dark money is even more dangerous because there are limits on campaign contributions. Over a certain amount, you have to record it and tell the government. Under, no. So effectively, if, for example, the limit is $10,000, then what am I going to do? I'm going to give you $9,999. And I can do that repeatedly. And you won't have to report it to the federal government. Another way around it is what I just mentioned. I have a PAC. My PAC gives to your PAC. Which gives to another PAC. Or sets up a website. We never have to disclose who we are. And in the case of lobbyists, big pharma, the big drug companies have 4 lobbyists for every person in Congress. And while there are fairly strict guidelines governing what a lobbyist can do or not do, and while there are theoretical limits on the amount of money they can give, Sonema in Arizona last year received $750,000 from drug companies. How likely is she to do anything about the price of drugs? The answer is she's not. So social policy ends up being disproportionately shaped by business. And if we look more closely at the whole lobbying thing for a second, in ethics and entrepreneurship last year, we were talking about this. And so one of my students said, sort of half jokingly, so Professor Falcon, what if I said, I know that you've had a really tough year, and I'd like to see you have some fun. How about I write you a check for $100? And by the way, coincidentally, I'd like an A. And another student said, well, the hell with that. How about if I just give you $1,000, Professor Falcon? Can I have an A? Well, lobbyists can't do either one of those things. But look at it this way. Lobbying is the equivalent of a student coming up to me and saying, Professor, I know you've had a very tough semester. So out of the goodness of my heart, I have reserved a room for you at Hilton Head for 3 days and 3 nights. And all you have to do is show up. That's the measure of my concern. Now, the first and the second are bribes. Isn't the third? According to the rules of lobbying, it isn't. Because I am not directly profiting. So if a drug company gives $500,000 to my campaign, it's not considered a bribe. Even if in the end, I'm compelled to vote in a way that mirrors the interest of the drug company and not my constituents. As long as I've been alive, this has been a problem. And one of the most recent phenomena we've seen is that people go to work in the government or they go to work in the military. They leave and they become a lobbyist. They use their contacts in the service of the people who are now paying them a lot of money. As far as I'm concerned, there are no grounds on which this is ethical. And as far as I'm concerned, equating value with power and money, the idea that capital has become a product, isn't moral or ethical either. So if you think about a lot of the issues that we've talked about this semester, there is either the assumption that morality is not a concern of business, or moral issues are different in business. We've talked about this multiple times. My problem with utilitarianism is that anytime you assert the greatest good for the greatest number, there is no concrete criteria as to what that ever means. And the greatest good for the greatest number in the history of utilitarianism has always come down to the greatest good for the fewest number. So before I take attendance tonight, I'll make a slightly apocalyptic comment. We are now 5 years after the MIT article was written, in which the researchers said that by 2038, 80% of the American population won't make enough money to survive. All the statistics I've seen since then indicate that they were dead right. So I stand by what I've told you numerous times this semester. in and of itself, capitalism is neither moral nor immoral. It's how capitalism is implemented in a given society. When the greatest good for the greatest number becomes the greatest good for the smallest number, we have a problem. Okay, any last minute questions before I turn the recording off and
Yeah.
take attendance?
I actually have one, and I've been thinking about that statistic ever since class started. And I was just wondering, does that mean that 80% of the population will be government reliant, or does that mean that people will go hungry and pretty much die off?
Okay, well, that, you see, is actually one of the most important questions we have to deal with. Because the counter to that argument is called a UBI. Universal basic income. If we couch this in traditional terms, this is some form of welfare, except it won't just be for the poor. It'll be for everyone. Because we can't have a consumer-based economy if no one has money to spend. We're seeing the effects of that now because of the ever-increasing consumer debt. And in fact, the health of our economy is measured by what is called the CCI, which is the Consumer Confidence Indicator. The CCI is not our willingness to produce. It's our willingness to go into debt. If people don't have money, how are they going to go into debt? Well, the answer that we're seeing, for example, when I was 17 years old and got my first car, most people got an auto loan for 3 years. Really expensive cars cost you 5. Now, I don't know of anybody who doesn't get at least a 5-year loan. And I'm beginning to see 7 to 8 years on a car loan, which means the car may die before you finish paying it off, which doesn't mean you don't finish paying it off. Or the revolution caused by rooms to go. They assume you can't pay for their product. So in theory, they give you 5 years of interest-free financing. In theory, interest-free. So what we're doing is subsidizing the lack of income through debt. But there's going to come a point where that isn't going to work anymore, which is going to take us right back to either a universal basic income or a massive collapse. I'll give you another example. Do you know what hydroponics is? Okay. Hydroponics is the technology that allows a 21st century farmer to grow produce without soil. Why are we still plowing the earth? Because, as I've been saying since the first day, intellectually, we live in one world, experientially, in another incompatible world. And if you look at what's happening, the Republicans are still saying, if you're poor, especially poor and of color, we don't want you to vote. And we don't want you to vote because you're not worth it. You're not adding any value. You may work in the factories. You may teach our students, our children. You may serve me at the country club. But you are not the future of our species. And the concept of race suicide, you'll remember that from the early part of the semester as well, is alive and well, except I would argue that it is no longer simply race suicide. It's now class suicide. CEOs receiving disproportionate compensation is symptomatic of class suicide. The death of the middle class is symptomatic of class suicide. Every kiosk that pops up in McDonald's that removes the need for another cashier is class suicide. Any other questions, comments, or thoughts? I hope that answered your question.
It did.
Good. Anybody else? All right, I'm going to stop the recording. I'm